All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on this All Things China edition, I'm proud to welcome back Pat Byrne. Pat was a longtime Irish Anglo trade unionist and leftist activist. And at the moment, he has a new book coming out all about China, which, of course, is very timely given the scary state of affairs with the pivot to Asia and whatnot. And also, Pat is working on a People's BRICS. So if you are part of the BRICS countries, and if you want your country to be a part of a People's BRICS, please do contact Pat and help us with this very interesting project, a people's-led project, as well as a journalism project that we're working on to keep people up to date on how the union movements, anti-imperialist movements, and the broad equality movements are going to be hopefully leading the charge of a people's BRICS as we try to break the unipolar world of the American empire and its British and pan-European partners in crime. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about China, because it's our All Things China's edition. Pat has a book out about China, which he'll talk more about. And in this three-part presentation, Pat's going to give a very good overview of China's history. We're first going to talk about of course, the Chinese Communist revolution to Mao's death. My only questions in advance is hopefully Pat's presentation is going to address this, is what China was like before the rise of Mao, the British colonialism and pan-European colonialism in China, which of course is the Century of Humiliation, and of course, the Chinese, of course, Japan's invasion of China. And of course, after that, Mao and Deng Xiaoping and others freeing China, and then of course, the rise of Mao and the many policies that he did. So first off, Pat, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Youri. Okay.
And in the 1, 2, 3, are you ready?
I'm ready. Yeah, fine.
All right, the floor is yours.
Okay, so the first part of this three-part sort of overview of China's modern history is to talk about the period from the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Revolution in 1949. And to be able to understand this revolution, we just need to say a very short few words about the background to the revolution. Now, China had, and I think most people are aware of this, China has had a long, long history, thousands of years of civilization and so forth.
Exactly.
And China had become, in that process, China had become the most powerful economy in the world. And something like as much as a third of the world economy was located in China. And China was, which is very funny when you see these statements about, oh, China can only copy things, they can't invent. But China had invented a lot of the major things that in the 19th century people took advantage of. That they developed paper first, ceramics, all kind of different things. And because of that, China was able to develop industries, pottery, all kind of powerful industries that were very popular in the West and were exported to the West. And so as a result, China was very rich. But that therefore attracted the Western countries to want to get a piece of that. And as they became, through a lot of war in Europe and competition, they developed their military technology, and then became the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And through that, they were able to bypass China in terms of technology and industry and economy. And they took full advantage of this. They started penetrating further and further into China. And eventually they took over China. Well, they took pieces of China. So you had all these, what they called concessions. So you had French concession, British concession, Japanese concession, the Americans took a chunk, and so on. And when China tried to resist, the British and the French in particular defeated them militarily in a couple of different wars. And they created a situation where the Chinese were really so weak that they couldn't resist. And they basically took over large chunks of China. And this led to a China that went through what they call the Century of Humiliation. It led to a disastrous result in China where over 100 million people died in various uprisings and battles. And China eventually, by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century, the emperor was removed. There was a kind of democratic, Western-style democratic revolution led by Sun Yat-sen. But this led to a weakening of the central authority in China, and it led to a division within the country, and the country being run by a lot of warlords for the first quarter of the 20th century. Sun Yat-sen's movement set itself the task of unifying the country and defeating these warlords, and that's where we saw the development of the Kuomintang, the famous nationalist Chinese movement, which was had millions of soldiers mobilized to that effect. Now, the Chinese communists, they developed towards the end of the 1910s and the beginning of the 1920s, and they were inspired by the Russian Revolution, and the Russian revolutionaries came to China to help them develop their movement, but they were not able to replicate the Russian Revolution because of this massive Kuomintang national army, which it meant that they were not developing in a normal situation where, like in Russia, they'd been able to build up support among the workers, have a democratic revolution in the cities, and so on. They tried to do this, but they were suppressed and massacred. And so they were forced, in a sense, to become fall back on the peasantry and develop a peasant guerrilla army. And interestingly, there was a lot of debates and arguments over this strategy, and it was Mao himself, in particular, who came forward with this strategy of the opposite of what the Bolsheviks had done in Russia, where they built support in the cities and then gone out to the countryside. And Mao he realized that couldn't be achieved in China. So he said, we have to win the countryside and surround the cities. And then that would be the opposite strategy, would be the only way forward. And he had a lot of arguments with the communists from the Soviet Union about this, but eventually his strategy prevailed. And it was logically the only strategy that could work in this situation. And so then we have a situation where the Chinese communists build up their forces in the countryside. I don't have time to go into the Long March and all these other aspects of it. But it also, another aspect of this was, of course, the role of Japan, who invaded China. So it was not only it only developed as a civil war between the communists and the nationalists in China, but also an external war between the Chinese and the Japanese, which and a lot of people don't realize that the Chinese in that war, in the Second World War, the Chinese lost 25 to 30 million people. It was as bad as the Soviet Union with the invasion by Hitler in the Soviet Union.
Well, and then sorry to interrupt, but I think it's also important to emphasize this. The Japanese were very, very, very brutal towards their colonial subjects, whether it was the Koreans, whether it was the Malays, whether it was the Thai, whether it was the Vietnamese, whether it was the Chinese and so forth, and the Mongolians. The Japanese were very, very brutal towards their colonial subjects, which does not get as much attention as it deserves. And I think when we even do, when we do sincere World War II commemorations, we should recognize the humongous sacrifice of the resistance groups led by Mao and Chiang-Kai-Sheck as well, Kim Jong-un, Ho Chi Minh, and so forth, because it was a very, very brutal occupation, and they also deserve their commemorations against Japanese fascism.
I mean, one of the aspects of this is that unfortunately the Japanese, when the Americans occupied Japan at the end of the Second World War, they never really purged the Japanese ruling elite of their reactionary forces. And they preferred to do a deal with them because their main priority was their rivalry with the Soviet Union. And so, unfortunately, the Japanese have never properly apologized for these dreadful things that they did to China. And that's still a sore point between the two countries that comes up from time to time if there's any conflicts. Anyway, so in that battle with the Japanese, the communists actually proved in many cases to be the most strongest forces in terms of most determined forces against the Japanese. And that gained them great credit with the Chinese population. Not only that, in the nationalist areas controlled by the Kuomintang under Chiang-Kai-Sheck, we had rampant inflation, and in the communist areas there wasn't. And so a lot of ordinary Chinese began to see the Chinese nationalist movement as incompetent economically, and there was also a huge level of corruption, so that it was interesting when Chiang Kai-shek's son went to Shanghai to try to reform the situation, he just had to give up because the corruption was so widespread. And so all of these factors gave the communists a lot of credibility. And last but not least, of course, was the fact that the Chinese communists were not just trying to become leaders of the country, but they wanted to transform the country and to end the poverty and the exploitation in what was still a semi-feudal situation. So the Chinese communists were determined to do land reform and get rid of the rule of the landlords, and to mobilize the country to build up living standards and so on. Whereas the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist movement were in bed with the landlords and with the capitalist mercantile elements. And so what that would mean is that a nationalist China would continue the old class oppression. So from about 1947, the Chinese communists actually implemented in their areas that they controlled land reform, and this motivated the peasants in those areas to fight for the communists. And that, of course, also motivated the peasants around the rest of the country to say, we want some of that. We want to end the rule of the landlords, and we want to have our own farms and be able to farm our own land. And then so when the Civil War broke out in 1947, after the Japanese had been expelled from China, the communists, despite the fact that the nationalists were a bigger army and much better armed, because they were getting all these modern arms from America, America sided with them.
And there was even a temporary truce between the communists and the nationalists in order.
Well, there was temporary, there was a temporary attempt by the Chinese to try to come to some sort of deal with the nationalists, but Chiang Kai-shek was virulently anti-communist and not willing to share power. So he was the one who broke the truce. And so
interesting.
It was interesting. So anyway, so the end result was that the Chinese communists were able to take over the whole country, and the nationalists went to Taiwan, or Formosa as it was known in those days, and they took with them the treasury of China. So all the money that was in the treasury they took with them to Taiwan, so that China was left in a situation with no money. I think they did a collection where they had about they collected up about $55,000 in foreign currency. That was all they had. And so they started out with a country that was ruined. It had been ruined by the Century of Humiliation, by all these events like the Boxer Rebellion, the warlords all around the country, 25 years of civil war with the Japanese. So China was in a desperate state. In fact, China was at that point estimated to be one of the 10th poorest country in the world.
Wow.
And for example, the age of death, the life expectancy was between 35 and 40 for Chinese people.
Wow.
So you can see how bad the situation was. So China started off with a very difficult situation. They did have some advantages, one of which was, hold on one second, hold on. Yeah,
no problem.
Okay. Yeah, so my stepdaughter calling me from Turkey. Yeah, so they had some advantages. First and foremost was that they, as I said, that they were determined to transform the country, and they weren't answerable to the landlords or the capitalists in the country. So they were free to do what the country needed to be done to make a step forward. And the other advantage was that they had the Soviet Union on their side. And remember, China, so at that point, the Soviet Union was the largest geographical country in the world by far. It still is, even Russia today.
Yeah.
And China, on the other hand, was the country with the largest population in the world. And they had a 10,000 kilometer common border. So this was an ideal marriage of, of land base with all the resources. Russia Soviet Union had all these minerals and other resources in its territory, whereas China had all the labor. It was a brilliant, potentially, marriage that bring the two forces together. And the Americans and the West were so frightened by this development, that they thought that, there was a potential that the Soviet bloc and China could become the dominant forces in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so that was a big plus that China had in this revolution. And in the first few years of the revolution, this came to pass. So the Soviet Union was willing to help China develop. So they sent they sent a lot of scientists over and engineers over to China. They helped them with their planning. They set up a lot of industrial plants and so on. So China got a flying start, but there was a practical problem in socialist strategy here, because one of the kind of contradictions of both the Soviet Revolution in 1917 and the Chinese Revolution in 1949 was that far from happening as Marx and Engels had foreseen, that they had thought was that the advanced countries like Germany, France, America, etc., they would be the countries that made the revolution.
Exactly.
Countries where the working class was the majority of the population, where industry was the dominant force, no longer agriculture. They thought that that's where the revolution would happen, and it would move logically on from an advanced industrial base to be able to implement socialism. But in irony is that the revolution took place in some of the weakest parts of the world, where agriculture was the dominant industry. So this was an inherent contradiction that bedeviled the Soviet Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. Now, what the Chinese did, very understandably, they regarded the Soviet Union as like a big brother, and therefore they were willing to accept whatever the big brother said to them as the best way forward. So they adopted the Soviet economic model, which was not really suited to Chinese circumstances. Because after all, if you think about it, the working class in Russia was small when the revolution happened, about 5% of the population. But it was even smaller in China. It was like maybe 1% or 1.5% of the population were working class. And so you had a situation where the dominant population were peasants, and the dominant industry was agriculture. So logically, what they needed to do was to build on that base and go forward from there. But because they adopted the the big brother from the Soviet Union's economic model, which was based on industry first, heavy industry first, not agriculture, they started to run into problems. At first, it was very successful. You know that agricultural production after the land reform that was introduced, it expanded a lot, and the peasants were very satisfied by their new situation. But what they then started to do was that they started to squeeze the peasants. And what they did was they paid the peasants lower than the real value of their production, with the idea that they would use that money to build up heavy industry in the cities. So what then happened by 1956, the peasants around China were starting to get very unhappy and discontented. As a result, to deal with this, the Chinese Communist Party organized a big survey across the country to find out what the problem was, and they were able to identify it. But instead of then doing what we now find out, you know, we're talking with hindsight. Instead of doing what happened under Deng Xiaoping many years later, Mao decided to go the opposite direction and double down on this policy of squeezing the peasants. And that's where we get the famous Great Leap Forward. Now, what?
Okay, interesting. And yes,
yeah.
So do explain.
So yeah, and so Mao had this idea that that the great strength of China was its labor force, the fact that it had hundreds of millions of workers, and you know, the most in any country in the world, and that they could, in a kind of crude interpretation of Marxism, that would create surplus value, and that was China's biggest strength. So he went for this policy of collectivization, where all the land reform had given the farms to the peasants. So they reversed that, and they collectivized all the land and forced all the peasants into communes. Now, this had been done under Stalin in 1928-29, and it hadn't worked well at all. And in fact, although it might seem that you know, it's a good idea, you know, from a socialist point of view, but it doesn't actually work practically for all kind of reasons I don't have time to go into. But if you want to, we can later on. Okay. And so when collectivization has been tried in the Soviet Union and in China and in Africa and so on, it hasn't worked. And in fact, it's led to a big fall in agricultural production and sometimes often to famines, both in the Soviet Union and in China and in Africa.
Actually, briefly explain, if it's even possible, why that hasn't worked. And my understanding of collectivization, which again, sounds like a great idea, is when you merge these small farms with big farms, and it's controlled by the government, and in theory, you're supposed to distribute the food and so forth equally, right?
Yeah, sure. The problem is that agriculture is not like industry.
Okay.
With industry, you can organize a factory, and you can have a standardized setup, and you get mass production going on, right? And you can organize production very efficiently. But agriculture doesn't work like that. You know, you've got the problem of the weather. You've got the problem of pests and disease. It's even a situation you can't standardize. So even in one field, different parts of the field have to be handled differently, because you've got different drainage, you've got different acidity, et cetera, and so when they try to use collectivization and top-down management, it just didn't work. And on top of that, you also had the problem of compensating people. So in a factory, you can pay people wages, and if you can see if they get a better output, you give them you know, a bonus and so on. But you can't do that in agriculture. It doesn't work like that. And so you get a lot of situations where workers who are either very efficient or they're very hardworking become resentful because other workers are going to still get the same compensation, but they don't get the same output. It could be because maybe even that they're lazy. It's just the land that that particular fields they're dealing with are not so productive as others. So it's a very, very difficult thing to standardize and organize agriculture. And that's why, if you look at the history of agriculture, the end of feudalism, and that's why the majority of the world went into individual farms, because the local farmers knew their farms very well. They had an incentive, very clear incentive structure to grow their crops and build their, to get their animals and so on. And one other important thing that wasn't understood and led to a lot of famine was that the way that individual farmers would operate would be that, for example, we saw the big famines in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and so on in the 1930s, which people talk about. And what it was that the farmers before that, they had a variety of agriculture that they were practicing. So they would be growing some crops. They would have animals, different types of animals that gave them dairy products, gave them meat, gave them hides and other things that they could use. And this variety of production methods gave them a lot of fallback and ability, so that when a drought came or a particular pest came and destroyed their crops in one thing, they had something to fall back on. So when they collectivized, unfortunately, all that was done away with. So they were all brought onto collective farms, and usually it was monoculture, so that they would just be growing wheat, for example, or whatever it might be, rice in China it might be. And then if a drought came along or pests came along, they had nothing else to fall back on. They had no variety. And so this led to a lot of people dying because of that. It's a little bit of a complicated process, but So when Mao introduced the Great Leap Forward, he had this idea, and it's a very complicated period, because there was a lot of rivalry going on within the communist movement internationally. After the death of Stalin, Khrushchev came to power, and Mao himself had felt that in many ways he was the second most important communist leader after Stalin, and he should have become the leader of the communist movement. So there was some kind of rivalry going on there. Also, Khrushchev decided to do some reforms in the application of communist foreign policy and other things, which Mao saw as betraying the communist ideal, that because he'd been brought up under Stalin's tutelage and seeing Stalin as the leader, following his ideas. So when he saw this new guy coming with different ideas, he started to call it revisionism, and to say that Khrushchev was abandoning communism. And there were other factors there as well, which is we don't have time to go into. But exactly.
And he also did not appreciate. He actually was furious when Khrushchev read out Stalin's dirty laundry, all his human rights abuses, because he felt that the West was going to, which the West did, that the West was going to weaponize that against the Soviet Union and other communist governments that had a revolution.
Yeah, well, one of the immediate results was that in Khrushchev's famous speech, where he, at the 20th Party Congress, where he his secret speech, which wasn't really, it was designed that it would get out. Part of his speech was to condemn the cult of personality that Stalin had inculcated, and not just for himself, but he'd also got the leaders of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe and in China. He'd encouraged them to do the same thing. So Mao had a cult of personality going in, because that was the model in China. So he naturally felt that very embarrassed by this situation, because it would affect him, and maybe people would start to question his leadership. So it's a very, very complicated situation. Anyway, so Mao launched this Great Leap Forward. The result of it was that they collectivized all the farmers. They also launched all kind of initiatives. So, for example, Mao started to try to implement the policies of Lysenko, the Stalinist scientist who put tried to introduce ideology into science.
Mm.
And so he started to introduce all sorts of stupid ideas from Lysenko, such as, for example, we should plant the rice much closer together, which the farmers for millennia in China knew was rubbish. But anyway, they did it, and of course it didn't work. And then they did the famous example of the killing all the sparrows, right? Because the sparrows were eating some of the crop. The sparrows would eat some of the harvest. So they killed all the sparrows by, over 3 days, they mobilized all the Chinese population to keep the sparrows awake. So they couldn't land and they couldn't, so on. And a lot of them died, and they would go and collect all the dead sparrows and take them to these kind of events, organized by the local party secretary, to show how many sparrows they killed and so on. The only thing that they didn't understand was that the sparrows were keeping down the insects. And so when the sparrows were all killed, there was huge plagues of insects and locusts and everything that ate far more of the crop than the sparrows had ever done. And the bottom problem was that they were not approaching this with the concept of scientific socialism, where you do experimentation first. You try things out, which is one of the great things that we see later on under Deng Xiaoping, was they learned from this experience that you don't just introduce a new policy all across the country at one time. You try it out in a couple of areas or in a couple of industries, see how it goes. And if it works, then you spread it across, or you learn from that experience that certain mistakes were made and you rectify them. And that's a scientific approach. But unfortunately, they weren't doing that. So they just introduced these policies across the whole country, and it was pretty disastrous. And at the same time, they were unlucky to have, as they had in Ukraine, they had some severe droughts, and the peasants had nothing to fall back on, and so huge numbers of the peasants died. Now, there's some exaggerations that say up to 40 million peasants died. Well, I think it's probably more likely around 10 million, but it was a large number, and it was a terrible time for Chinese people, of hunger and starvation and death. Now, Mao was blamed for this, and Mao had to back down and take a back seat, and he had to publicly apologize for this policy. A lot of people don't know that, but that's actually what happened.
Interesting. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so the people who had been planning and organizing in the 1950s before the Great Leap Forward, they took control for the next 2 years, and the GDP started to rise again. So GDP had risen very well in the 1950s until the Great Leap Forward, and then in the 2 years that followed the Great Leap Forward, it rose again. But meanwhile, Mao was not happy with the situation of him being sidelined. He still held this top titular position, but he no longer had day-to-day control. And so he devised this Cultural Revolution. And to what extent he actually believed in the things he put forward in the Cultural Revolution, I'm not 100% sure. But certainly he used it as a means to regain power. And so we see a period in the 1960s, from 1966 till, well, it did ease off before in the 1970s, but effectively until his death. The Cultural Revolution damaged the GDP production in China. Huge numbers of party officials were put in jail or sent to the countryside and punished, including Deng Xiaoping, including the current President Xi's father, etc., millions of them. Now,
so it was a period. It was a period. I guess if you want to compare the French Revolution's reign of terror, could you sort of compare like the reign of terror to the Cultural Revolution, a period of deep political harassment of other communists and so forth, and people who were accused of not being, I guess, patriotic enough, communist enough, and so forth. So a lot of people faced deep harassment coming from the student wing of the of the Communist Party of China.
Sure. Yeah, the Red Guards and all that. Yeah. I mean, you could argue that there are patterns of development in revolutions, and you could argue that there was some element to that you know, that the reaction that existed following the French Revolution, there's certain elements as well. You know, the one of the sad things, and this brings me up to the death of Mao. You know, Mao is a very complex character, and a lot of people are confused as how could it be that Mao, having made these mistakes with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, how could it be that Mao is still very popular in China? And you have to understand that Mao is a very interesting character. He number one, he was the guy who came forward with the winning strategy in the Civil War. And it wasn't easy to achieve that. He had to defeat a lot of people, especially from the Soviet Union, to get that implemented. Then he was successful in achieving the Civil War, leading it through. And there were lots of mistakes they could have made and lost that war. So there's no way that the Chinese Revolution could have happened without Mao's role. So, you know, all the good things that have happened since the revolution wouldn't have been possible without Chairman Mao's participation. So you have to see, and not only that, he did a lot of good things as well. So, for example, you know, they introduced a lot of new novel ideas where they brought in a grassroots medical service called the Barefoot Doctors, which brought medical services to the mass of the people. And although the communes were not the most efficient way of doing things, they used them to bring in, there was mass primary education and even secondary education. They did feed the people. So a lot of things were developed and succeeded under Mao, even if there were some mistakes. Now, one thing I would say is that there are a lot of people who criticize Mao for being brutal, right? Mm. And that was undoubtedly true. That was the case, that a lot of brutality happened in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But I think you have to understand that Mao originally, as a young man, was not a brutal person. In fact, a very cultured person. People don't realize that it was Mao's poems that inspired the Red Army and his sayings. You know, he was a very cultured person, very well-read intellectual. But sadly, the Civil War and the war with the Japanese brutalized Mao and the whole army for very obvious reasons. You're dealing with terrible enemies who are, I mean, Chiang-Kai-Sheck was absolutely vicious, and the Japanese even worse. And then you've got internal, you know, spies and all kinds of things going on. And so the revolution that emerged in 1949 was not the same as in the Soviet Union. It was very.
Would you even say that the conditions that the Chinese faced were even more brutal compared to what was the Tsarist Russia and the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik?
Definitely far more brutal, what they had to go through. I mean, think about it. There was a civil war that ran, and then a war with the Japanese that ran from 1927 to 1949. That's a whole generation we're talking about there, you know, of brutality. You know, civil wars are always the most brutal wars. So you can imagine and I would say that even today, the Chinese state is, because every institution is marked by its history, isn't it? Comes out of its history. We understand that. And so even today, China is slowly but surely coming out of these things and are affected by its history. So that was the first part one of the Chinese Revolution from 1949 to 1976 when Mao died. So that's so that then lays the basis for what happens next, which has led to this huge explosion of the Chinese economy.
Fantastic. And folks, join us for that. We were joined by Pat Byrne, and please join us for part 2 of our conversation on Chinese history through a post-colonial Marxist perspective.